We're going into the home stretch now to our panel that's going to wrap it up and have all the answers for us to all the questions that have been raised. But that's exploring how libertarianism affects culture. And to lead us here as moderator, we have Caitlin Hendel, who was named CEO and president of National Catholic Reporter this past January, but of course is no stranger to either politics or the press and reporting here in Washington, as well as outside the Beltway as well. So we'll welcome Caitlin to give us her fine skills as moderator today.
Thank you. So I've been reminded many times that alcohol will be served at 4:45, and that it is my responsibility to make sure we stay on time. So very briefly, in journalism, in story writing, we have a phrase we refer to as the so what graph, the so what paragraph of a story. A story gives you the facts, what happened, but then that so what graph gives you that sort of context of what it really means in whatever's going on. I like to think of this panel as our so what panel. We've had a wonderful day of exploring the chasm between libertarian thought and Catholic social teaching, and I think this is the panel that sort of takes all of that we've heard today and puts it into this place for us, in how it fits into our culture, how it applies to our culture today. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker on this panel. He's Lew Daly. As we heard before, bios are all in here, so I'm not going to read them with alcohol in mind. But this is our first panelist is Lew Daly of Demos, and I'll let you take it.
Okay. Thank you. So I do feel obligated to start with some facts, which are a sadly rare commodity in this city, and especially in that big white building to the left of us. And I do want to focus on something that I work on every day, and I feel obliged to as a policy wonk of sorts, which is a little bit of an outline of what's happening to households, and particularly the economic well-being of households in this libertarian age. I think we're definitely in trouble. I think it's true that earnings for most are flat or in decline, even as we're working more hours per household, and even as sort of our life cycle costs in terms of how we secure our welfare. Our life cycle costs for things like health and education are skyrocketing. So that press between flat wages, more hours, and higher life cycle costs, it's not only an income problem, it's a social welfare problem. Here's one amazing fact. This is from new, really groundbreaking research by Mian and Sufi at the University of Chicago on the housing crash. 50% of mortgage debt arising before the financial crash and 40% of subsequent defaults was from people who were already homeowners, not new purchasers. The debt was from home equity loans to pay for things like health, college, and economic emergencies. The fact that we have to borrow money on such a scale to secure these kinds of basic welfare needs is really a sign of an economy with severely diminishing potential for welfare in its very design, in my view. And the consequences of this are all around us. On other measures of social health, which John can speak to much more fluently than I can, we simply have not made much progress. In some areas, we've regressed, despite decades of economic growth and the promise that that growth would deliver progress. And really, by measures of civic health, we're really experiencing something like a total collapse. This doesn't get to the issues with our labor market institutions, which I'll leave to Maria. So I see all of this through the lens of Catholic teaching, and particularly through the strain of Catholic teaching that some of us call social pluralism, the focus on associational life. This is what Professor Hirschfeld pointed to in terms of sort of the binary model of market and state is completely missing the essence of Catholic social teaching, which is around our associational life. And this reaches back to an earlier, now considered reactionary heritage of social pluralist thought developed by thinkers such as Lamennais and Bonal and Tocqueville and an important Dutch Reformed variant with Abraham Kuyper. Really, this was the most potent non-socialist challenge to liberalism before the rise of social democracy, and its nucleus, as others have pointed to, was the defense of communal forms of life, particularly those which are anchored in communal forms of property and the communal control of markets. Importantly, liberalism here was challenged, as others have noted, in both its political and economic forms, which is to say that it was challenged as a unified system of antisocial domination. No more. We now have this binary market state model, and as our earlier social Catholic ancestors would have seen today, having sort of cleared away community for capitalism, not least by confiscating the communal properties of the church, today the state itself is besieged by the very economic power it unleashed, and it's all in the name of liberty. So our comparatively sparse protections for workers, our sparse or ill-targeted social welfare policies, our extreme concentration of wealth, these are all signs of a disturbed social order where freedom and human flourishing are no longer a common experience, but only a birthright of the few. Now, in my highly untrained way, theologically speaking, I know that all of this grows out of our rejection of the Creator. I have no doubt of this, but for me, as an analyst of culture, as an analyst of policy, the question is sort of, how did that happen? How is this working in our culture, and particularly in our political culture? So I want to, again, through the lens of the importance of associational life as a source of welfare, I want to focus on kind of two sort of fault lines in our political culture that I think embody the failed philosophy of libertarianism. One is the philosophical idea of the libertarian idea that taxation is theft, that essentially taxation is a form of criminal enterprise. And another is something that's visible in, I think, the abundant evidence of unequal protections for associational life that we have through American history, actually going back to the founding. So starting with taxation is theft. The way this problem sort of works through our culture and the way our economic life is understood is we sort of have this idea that there's a market and people go to work and they get their earnings from the market, and this is what they deserve on the basis of liberal rights. Then there's a big red divide, and there's what government does. It taxes, it redistributes, it corrupts, it uses the money for the wrong things, all coercively and all against those the rights of earners. The problem with that is those earnings that seem to or are narrated to come directly from the market based on individual contributions are in fact highly socialized earnings to begin with. There's a huge social surplus related to all of our marginal products that's left out of the discussion that leads you to think taxation is theft. And even in economics, mainstream economics, we can see this when Robert Solow famously set out to start studying the sources of economic growth in the 1950s. He was really shocked, and later he won the Nobel Prize for this work, to find that something like 80% of economic growth up to that point was not attributable to capital accumulation, what businesses provide, or to population growth, what workers and individuals preside. He ended up calling it the technological advance. In the literature, it's this thing called the Solow residual, and initially it was sort of a black box, but now we know a lot more about things like human capital. We know a lot more about things like the public role of investing in scientific advances. We know a lot more about the importance of infrastructures. These are really the sources of 20th century wealth and 21st century wealth. None of them are individual. None of them are our individual marginal products. It's all collective. So if you take that 80% and you think of that as the social surplus on top of what we do in fact contribute, morally that surplus should be available for redistribution for social needs. Libertarian says no, because it doesn't perceive and doesn't acknowledge the huge social surplus that makes us all so much more productive than we were even in the 19th century. The other fault line I want to point to is this question of the unequal protection of associational life. And I see this, and I've written about this, look at the differences in the legal history of trade unions compared to the legal history of associations of capital, that is, business. Workers' associations were either legally or politically suppressed in the United States from the founding of America until the Great Depression. Rich Trumka talked very eloquently about his experiences with this. So in legal history, they were essentially determined to be conspiracies against property rights and a kind of a ideal liberal contractual order. Whereas associations of capital, although originally put under a concept of public chartering by the founding, where the activities of business are confined within norms of public interest, eventually, over the course of the 19th century, business worked its way out from under public interest chartering to the point where by the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age, in the era of the Lochner Court and so forth, businesses had basically been enthroned with nearly full constitutionally protected property rights to do whatever it wanted to do. Now, there was a great counter reform against that, right, with the New Deal Court and so on, the first instance of which was the constitutional acceptance of minimum wage legislations. But now there's pushback back in the other direction. First, primarily or initially taking the form of giving new constitutional protections to corporate spending, to corporate money in our political system as a form of constitutionally protected speech. But believe me, if you look at the jurisprudence of Roberts and others on the court, they want to go much, much further to the point of overturning the statutory laws that the New Deal courts said were constitutional. So if you sort of follow those two fault lines, you can see the fractures that are flowing from a libertarian ideology in our political culture. And I don't have a lot to say about how we can fix it, but I do agree with Professor Hirschfeld that even as it's really important to change this and address this at the level of policy, both defensively and offensively, none of that will last unless we're changing people's hearts and minds. A policy change that does not win the support of people at the level of fundamental values is always going to be vulnerable to change. And I think part of what we've seen in terms of the rollback of the welfare state is a reflection of that. So I want to underline the idea that the role of the church is to really win this in the culture more than in our politics. Thank you.